Good evening. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, February the 5th, 2024. I'm Councillor Chad Rintoul, chairing Committee of the Whole this evening, and I'm joined this evening by Councillor Duck to my right, along with Councillor Duncan, Councillor Garnett, and to my left, Councillor Novak, Councillor O'Keefe, and Mayor McNeil Smith, along with members of Town of Sydney staff. Thank you for joining us this evening. At this point, I would like to call the meeting to order, and I'll respectfully acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the traditional territory of the Wasanich people. First item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. I'll look for a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any comments or suggestions on the agenda? Seeing none, I'll move the question. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. We have a public participation at Committee of the Whole. 20 minutes are allotted, 4 minutes for speaker. If there's anyone in the public who would like to come forward, please do so at this time. I'll call a final time for anyone to come forward. Public participation. Seeing none, I'll close public participation. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. We have regular Committee of the Whole minutes from November the 20th.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. Any observations with the minutes, comments, edits? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion is carried. Thank you. This evening's Committee of the Whole meeting is introduction to the 2024 through 2028 draft financial plan. Presentation by our Director of Finance, Mr. Andrew Hissick. And so I will call on you, Mr. Hissick, at this time. And if you would kindly let us know your expectations around questions throughout your presentation, then I'll try and keep an eye out on members of the committee who may have questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As is our custom, the initial budget meeting is meant as my introduction of the budget to council and the public. It's not necessarily meant to be interactive. You were just given your budget binders this evening, and I would hope that questions could be limited to ones for clarifying information that you just heard. Perhaps if something comes up during the presentation, they could get your attention, but preferably it would be after the fact. And again, just to clarify something that you heard, and let's keep the detailed questions for the next meeting, which is scheduled for 2 weeks tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. I'll turn it over to you.
Welcome, Council, to the presentation of the 2024 to 2028 financial plan, or alternatively, the 2024 budget. Now, this is not the usual first slide you see, but I think it's about time we focused not just on the big dollar sign, but everything that it pays for. And this is a good starting example of that. So you've got the full range of typical municipal services, and the unfortunate fact is that these cost money, and the world is becoming a more expensive place. We are not immune to that. I'll start off with a very quick overview of the process. Not everyone here has been through it as many times as the mayor has, probably about 8 or 10 now. It is fairly new to a couple of our newer council members, and possibly for members of the public viewing this at home or at a later date. According to our legislation, we have to have a rolling 5-year financial plan, which is updated each and every year. Until the new financial plan is adopted, the previous one, as adopted or as amended, which we saw recently, is fully in effect, and we have all the authority we need to operate and to carry out delivering services. And once adopted, this financial plan will be the basis upon which the tax rates are set in May. A quick overview of timing. It's a three-step process typically. We start with this introduction, which is my presentation of the materials in a way that will hopefully assist you in your review of the documentation. The budget package has been distributed, and the town's website will have the 2024 budget page live tomorrow morning, and that's to include a copy of this presentation. You have a paper copy at the back of your binders should you choose to make use of it. So tonight I'm going to clearly outline the starting point for deliberations, and I need to outline that it's just a starting point. We typically find a way to reduce the ultimate tax impact as we go. This year we might find it more challenging than in past years, but I have no doubt that we'll be able to find some methods of reducing the tax impact. Now the next meeting is 2 weeks tomorrow, at which time there will be a shorter, updated presentation with some additional information. There will be a number of detailed staff reports in the agenda covering some of the larger tax impacts in a lot more detail than you're going to get tonight or than you see in your binder. The next meeting will be the first opportunity for the public to make comments, ask questions, and it'll be the first chance for council to discuss the budget, clarify aspects, and make resolutions for changes. Following that meeting, we'll be incorporating everything that was resolved at that time into a second draft of the financial plan, which will be presented at a special council meeting on Tuesday, March 5th. Typically, the third meeting represents our final budget deliberations. Only once in my 12 years of doing this have we required more than one meeting, and that was over a decade ago. Council's done a good job over the years in narrowing it down at the first opportunity, and I have no doubt we'll be able to do that again. So the goal for that third meeting is approval of the financial plan, but if additional meetings are required, they can be scheduled at that meeting, and depending on how much work has to go into the next process will dictate when exactly that additional meeting might be. So tonight's goal is to introduce the draft budget, provide an overview of the major impacts, outline some of the major capital projects and supplemental requests, and to add more context to your pending review of the budget documentation. So you're going to see a bit of repetition from year to year because I think it's relevant. I think last year I called this a unique budget year. Well, guess what? It's another unique budget year. It goes back to 2020 when we had approved our financial plan in February of that year at a modest 1.97% tax increase, and then COVID hit. We ended up reopening the budget, reducing the increase to 0 for residential properties, and instituting a 10% cut for commercial properties. After we did that, we found out that we were the beneficiaries of a significant amount of provincial funding called the Safe Restart Grant, which essentially allowed us to make up for some of the lost reserves we used to reduce the budget, and it gave us several years to phase back to full taxation revenues. So in the subsequent 3 years, we've been using up that Safe Restart funding to cushion the impact of getting back to full revenue levels, and also to help account for new tax impacts along the way. So we've been providing updates on the remaining balance of the Safe Restart funding each and every budget year. And as indicated last year, we'd be down to our very last bit for 2024, somewhere in the neighborhood of 126,000. And we need a jump in taxes to make up for that lost revenue. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail as we go here. And as of next year, we're fully on our own in terms of taxation. No more Safe Restart funds to help get us back to where we need to be. Essentially, next year will be it. So last year, we highlighted the incredibly high level of inflation that we faced from the previous calendar year. Last year's impact was nearly 7%. And that was the highest inflation rate that I ever had to deal with in my budgeting history. It was lower this time around, but still relatively high at 3.71%. And it's really the cumulative impact of the last 2 years that we're facing tonight, not just 1 year worth of cost pressures. So that cumulative effect is really impacting our ability to keep our increases to a bare minimum, as we were known to do prior to the last couple of years. So as mentioned earlier, everything does cost more, and we are not immune to that. So we continue to face an ever-expanding mandate of responsibilities that typically were not local governments. So we're talking about ongoing pressure to respond to service needs in areas such as affordable housing, homelessness, climate change, accessibility improvements, economic development, and medical first response. All of this while grappling with our traditional responsibilities of setting aside enough funds to take care of our infrastructure, as well as expanding our recreational opportunities. So, having buried the lead, this is the slide we're always waiting for, is what is our starting point for deliberations? And I'm here to report that the draft financial plan starts out with our highest ever starting point in my tenure here at 8.42%. But that amount includes several new budget items that are not yet council approved, and we'll be going through those in detail throughout the process. If any of those end up being deferred or simply rejected, that will reduce our 8.42 starting point. So we'll cover what's included in that 8.42 starting point, and we'll identify some of the areas that we need to focus on and decisions to be made as we go through the next 2 meetings. So coming into the budget every year, staff do our level best to come in with the lowest possible starting point. And we did that again this year by taking advantage of all available funding sources. However, at the end of the day, we felt that we should begin this budget process with a realistic look at the level of tax increase we need to pay for everything that we would like to do as an organization in response to internal and external desires. So we've talked about some of the external pressures, but we also have staff wanting to do more and better for the community all the time, and we bring forward initiatives that we think will do that. So just because we start out at 8.42 doesn't mean we have to end up there. We can take advantage of additional funding sources on a one-time basis. Although I've done my best to already do that, we do have a little bit of leeway of perhaps using more of prior year's surplus to pay for 1 or 2 of the one-time cost impacts. And I'm not assuming that all supplemental requests or tax-funded capital items will be approved. Typically, there is some movement in that area. Quick review of our budget glossary, more for the benefit of those not familiar with our language. So we have what we call water, sewer, and general funds. Each one of those two has an operating and capital component. Key features of all three of these will be highlighted. So what we call capital budgets is typically made up of the renewal of our existing infrastructure and other existing town assets, as well as new items or projects on behalf of the community. And they're presented in terms of ongoing programs, new items, and items carried forward for completion. All the funding sources for a capital plan are clearly identified, and the level of annual tax funding is somewhat consistent from year to year, and it's much lower than it used to be for a variety of reasons. So typically when we go over the capital budget, it's the tax-funded items that get the most attention, because those are the ones that will have an impact on the tax increase for the year. We also have what we call supplemental requests, which are part of the operating budget. And these are changes to existing service levels, whether they are new or additional services. They're often one-time studies or minor operating items that may or may not recur. We present them in terms of one-time or ongoing items. Sometimes they could be major ongoing items, such as hiring additional personnel in various departments. And they often result from external requests, like a community support request. This year we have one from the SBIA. In past years we've had requests from the Shaw Center, museum, and other sources. There tend to be a certain level of these every year, although the level does fluctuate. And the more detailed items will be backed up in those reports that I mentioned earlier on the next council agenda. So when we talk about service levels during these budget discussions, what we mean is we have a base budget which is developed to maintain the existing level of service to taxpayers, so what people expect. So what does it cost us to provide the same level of service that we provided last year, factoring in inflation? Anything beyond that is flagged as a supplemental item in most cases, unless it's already been council approved. So staff use our collective experience along with the latest external and internal information to determine the cost of delivering council approved service levels. And that's what goes into the base budget. So we don't budget for worst case by any means, only the most likely case based on our experience. So the various departmental budgets are developed on that basis, and we look at the bottom line for each function, not particular line items or the makeup of each budget, just the overall cost of providing that service. So it's not always an increase in a function. We look for efficiencies where possible, and there are always fluctuations between priorities. So you'll see an increase in one function one year and then another function in another, and vice versa with decreases. So we talk about reserves, and we are allowed to set aside funds in reserves for specific purposes, and these are typically done by bylaw. And once these are established by bylaw, those funds can only be used for the purposes for which they were set aside. Typically, these are for asset replacement, such as our infrastructure, roads, drainage, water, and sewer, but they're also for vehicles, computers, and the ferry terminal. We have some less defined capital reserves, like general capital, and we have some miscellaneous reserves, like the land sale reserve, amenities, and the fairly recently created climate action reserve. And you'll see new for this year the Growing Communities Fund Reserve, which is made up of the $3.82 million we received last year from the province, and we were required to set it up in a reserve. Council has already approved 2 or 3 uses of those funds, but it's in this budget that they will be captured once again, along with some new proposed uses for council to consider. So as we talk about reserves, you'll wonder what is the required balance that we should aim for in each reserve? And that's a good question. And the answer is it depends on our plans and our funding strategies. Some are very easy to establish, like vehicles and computers, where you look at the replacement cost of what we own, and we calculate when and how much it'll cost to replace, and we set aside funds systematically along the way to ensure we have them in place when required. Other reserve balances are more difficult to establish, such as the infrastructure reserve, and we've been working on enhanced asset management plans over the last 2+ years, and we're getting closer to completion. And hopefully in the next year or two, we'll have a better answer for what those reserve levels need to be, and we'll report to council on potentially phasing in any potential increase to those reserves. Reserve balances tend to be cyclical, so some years we put aside more money than we use, and others, when we have a major project, we will consume more than we set aside, and that's completely normal. We have very limited reserves for things like building replacement and waterfront infrastructure other than the ferry terminal. So building up these reserves, if that's in fact what we decide to do, will take many years to do. And that's why in the past we've typically used borrowing to pay for things for which we do not have reserves. So a long-term financial planning process might include a combination of reserve funding as well as a reasonable level of borrowing. A table of our beginning reserve balance is included in your binder. It also includes the 2024 contributions we are planning to make and the proposed uses in 2024 based on the draft budget. Finally, you have the ending balance. And just a quick overview of this table. You have the upper section, which is in pink. Essentially, those are our replacement reserves, the ones for which we typically set aside funding. That's followed in yellow by the two parking reserves. One is for off-street, the other we turned into an alternative transportation reserve by splitting it 50-50 last year. And we don't set aside funds in that reserve. It comes in from parking variances through development. And those are unpredictable. We do not budget for those. We typically recognize them as they come in. Climate Action Reserve and General Capital, those are two for which we do have annual contributions. Water and Sewer Capital, there are small balances we're using up and then they'll disappear. Amenities Reserve is typical to parking, where that funding comes in through development, and we recognize it as we get it. We do expect some amenity contributions to roll in this year based on what's in stream, and that will certainly help to supplement our funding capacity for next year. Land sale reserve is essentially made up of the proceeds from the sale of the old fire hall, and it's virtually all gone and will be probably by the end of 2025. The Growing Communities Fund, as I just mentioned, it's $3.82 million. We have $2.437 in the draft budget for council's consideration. Finally, the Canada Community Building Fund Reserve used to be known as gas tax. We do get contributions from the federal government every year, roughly in the order of $600,000. Now that agreement does expire at the end of March this year, but we have every indication that it will be renewed, although we don't know what changes will be made. The last time it was renewed, they expanded the eligibility rules for how it can be spent, and we'll see what happens this time in terms of those rules as well as the funding levels. Now, borrowing or debt. It's important to note, and I reinforce this every chance I get, that any debt held by the town is for capital purposes only. We are not allowed to borrow for operating needs. It must be for capital acquisition or construction. So senior governments are known for incurring deficits to fund their operations. We can't do that. We have to keep an accumulated surplus from operations, and we cannot go into the red on that. We have a policy in place to maintain that at a certain level, and I'll get into more details on that later. Rules around borrowing are clearly identified in our legislation, and it's based on percentages of your annual revenues and how much you are deemed to be able to afford to pay in annual debt payments. The town has relatively low levels of debt. More can be incurred if required, subject to public process. So while I'm certainly not encouraging more debt, I'm certainly not discouraging it either if we have high enough priorities that we can't wait to accumulate funds for them. It may and perhaps should form part of our long-term funding strategies. We do have access to short-term borrowing, which is small amounts of borrowing of up to 5 years, and we can access up to $50 per resident, or $600,000 roughly, with no public process. So you might wonder how we develop our budgets. I touched on this earlier before. It's based on council requests, community requests, and the best judgment of trained, experienced staff to maintain the service levels we have, to make purchases that will reduce ongoing operating costs, and to add new features or amenities for council's consideration. So our staff take their roles very seriously and bring forward ambitious plans each year to address service expectations of both council and the public. So moving into the different budget areas, we have our water utility, which essentially is just a distribution system. We purchase bulk water from the CRD, and we pay for the operation and maintenance of our distribution system, renewing that infrastructure, and for certain capital projects related to that system. Water utility is funded with a combination of parcel taxes and user fees, with a $75 infrastructure levy on the annual tax notice, and quarterly utility bills featuring a fixed charge of $20 per quarter, and a consumption charge which is based on the amount of water each user consumes. This budget sees a small increase to a new cost of just over $6 per 1,000 gallons consumed, and what we've done over the last few years is simply pass on the increase in the bulk water rates. As you'll recall, we did a major review of our water rate structure several years ago, and we implemented that in 2021. It provides sufficient revenues to ensure financial sustainability of the water utility. Gives us stable revenues to match our cost structure, and a better matching of fees paid to the benefits received. So as I've reported every chance we've had, the new rate structure is working exactly as intended, and we're able to simply pass on the bulk water rate increases. The sewer utility, it represents largely Sydney's share of the unified treatment plant, which serves the peninsula, as well as the costs of operating and maintaining our collection system. Once again, it's funded with a combination of parcel taxes and user fees, with a parcel tax collected on the tax notice and the user fee on the quarterly utility bill. there is an increase up to 8.85 per thousand gallons proposed. And this is increase simply is the percentage increase that we received from the CRD for our share of the treatment plant operation. So we are hoping to begin our review of the sewer rate structure late this year once we get back to full staffing levels, and we're hoping to undertake the review in the last quarter of this year and perhaps have the rates in place for 2025. Now, the general operating fund provides for all municipal functions other than sewer and water. So the program areas are Legislative Services Council, as well as general government, which covers admin, finance, IT, driver services, and some common costs that apply to the entire operation. Also includes protective services like police, fire, emergency programs, building inspections, bylaw enforcement. Engineering and works, other than the water and sewer, is made up of the roads, storm drains, docks and ports, and other ancillary services. We also have solid waste services, which are more funded by utility fees than they are by taxation, but there is a tax component to them as well. We have a growing environmental services function, as well as an important municipal planning function. We have a parks function that is beloved by the community. We get more complaints for the way we maintain our parks and our public spaces than we do for anything else. Compliments, I said, right? Not complaints. We also have what we call cultural services, made up of library, which is contracted through Vancouver Island Regional Library. We have a senior center at Shoal, and we have two what we term museum services. One is historical, the other is the Shaw Center for the Salish Sea. And it's rounded off by fiscal services, which covers things like reserve transfers, debt payments, and a high level of community support. I'm going to get into some of the significant impacts, and then I'll take you through function by function what some of the individual impacts are to each municipal operating department. So some of the things we're looking at here that will make up the 8.42 starting point is a high level of supplemental requests for the year, contributing a net increase of $271,000. We also have a one-time impact of having to replace our long-serving chief administrative officer, and we're estimating that cost to be up to $195,000 for the recruitment consultant, as well as some overlapping salary costs. We also have an increase of about $100,000 in reserve contributions, and reducing those impacts, we've got a small growth in the tax base and the remainder of our Safe Restart grant. Now, for our core operating budget, so we didn't have any across-the-board inflationary increases. As typical, we asked our budget managers to look at only for increases where they're absolutely required to maintain service levels, such as utility costs that are outside our control, or certain contractual obligations that have previously been incurred. However, as mentioned earlier, it's the cumulative impacts of inflation over the last 2 years that have required a larger than normal catch-up increase this year. So getting into the first functional area, we have legislative and general government. We're looking at a net increase of $283,000 on a net budget of $2.6 million. So as mentioned, 195 of that is because of the CAO replacement. So without that, it would be a much more modest level of less than 100,000. And that's a one-time cost which we have no choice but to incur, but it's something that'll fall off the books next year. Another impact to this department is some annual software licensing costs, which have also accumulated over the past few years. They're due to changes in the way we work. So it's for additional backup, it's for online services we've added since COVID, and it's for it's a head start on our records management project, which we introduced a few years ago and is currently on hold, but we do expect to get back to it later this year or next. So the RCMP, we're looking at a very modest $30,000 increase from last year, despite the fact that the RCMP contract increased by nearly $170,000. What we were able to do this year is offset that increase by taking some savings from last year and carrying them forward to defray the increase. So an additional officer was approved as part of last year's budget, and we're not expecting that position to start until this year. Despite that additional officer, we are not expected to ever have a full complement of 16 RCMP officers, and North Saanich has 12, and there's also 6 provincial federal members, and our staff sergeant does their best to keep it as staffed as possible. However, we can rely on some level of savings in this function each and every year because we simply cannot keep all 32 officer positions fully staffed. Now, a big impact that we've heard about for a number of years is the anticipated assumption of dispatch costs, which we expect will begin in April 1, 2025. Well, we are still in discussions as a South Island group with the ministry. We have been led to believe that it will go ahead in 2025 unless we hear otherwise. We'll keep doing what we can to postpone or reduce that. But as of now, we're planning for a partial impact next year and a full impact in the 2026 budget year. The next area of protective services is fire and emergency. So we're looking at a net increase over last year of $276,000. And a lot of this, well, almost all of it is due to supplemental requests. And these are required because of call volumes reaching record levels for, I believe, the 3rd or 4th year in a row. And we'll get into much more detail on this in the staff report for the next meeting. But essentially, we've been telling you for a couple of years that we have to staff up to keep up with our growing population and our additional height and density downtown. You can't keep growing without corresponding increases to public safety, and you're going to see that on the fire and police side. And we're also looking at higher dispatch costs due to our volume of calls last year. So the idea of one more firefighter for this year was introduced a couple of years ago. And last year we told you that all these future requests would be carefully considered before being brought back. Well, we absolutely need one more firefighter for at least most of this year. And we are looking at a second deputy in 2025, partway through the year. Another supplemental request is for the expansion of the overnight coverage, which began as part of a COVID safety measure, but was formalized last year. In addition, we're going to be bringing forward a few adjustments to the premiums paid for non-career firefighter coverage, including the overnight staffing. Building inspection and bylaw enforcement, it's a very small increase of 13,000, related primarily to the parking enforcement contract, somewhat offset by additional revenues. Development services is looking at a net decrease from last year of 41,000. That's because a couple of one-time supplementals fell off the books from last year, that being the zoning bylaw and the accessibility plan. So the zoning bylaw was not completed, but we took that funding and we carried it forward. So there's no impact for this year. And we are using a number of provincial grants for the anticipated housing policy work that we have to do. Engineering and works, we're looking at a net increase of just over 144,000 on a net budget of 2.35 million. 80,000 of that, or more than half, is in supplemental items, and those are related to the active transportation plan and parking study follow-up and additional accessibility work. Now, engineering and parks are seeing larger increases than we're used to, but I would like to commend those two departments for doing everything they can over the previous years to keep their budgets fairly stable from year to year. But they finally reached a point where they can't do that anymore without service level impact. So we're seeing a little more than we're used to. Environmental services, we're looking at a net increase of just over 18,000 from last year. Most of the work in that department is covered by provincial grant funding. The local government climate action plan grant, which covers more and more programs and initiatives that our coordinator is bringing forward, including a couple of new ones this year. So that small increase is essentially all due to more of that climate action grant going to programs and less to the staffing. Parks and cultural, I mentioned my gratitude to that department for keeping it low for a number of years, but now some catch-up is required. So the last couple of years we had longer growing and maintenance seasons, which there's not very much we can do about. We have to mow the grass, we have to water the trees and the grass. We're required for the playing fields. We have events that require more and more support. We have 11,000 in supplemental requests as part of that 125,000. The Beacon Community Services contract for the Senior Center was recently approved. That's included in that figure. And core operations went up by about 89,000. Now, fiscal services, it looks like a large increase, but there are revenue offsets for most of this. So you'll see the expenditure side here, but the revenue side is under our general revenue section, or under the docks and ports section in the example of the ferry terminal lease revenues. So we are increasing our overall transfers to reserve by 255,000, although only 95,000 of that is a tax impact, because there are offsets and captured elsewhere in the budget. Now, the community support budget is looking at an increase of 125,000, which is made up of some inflationary commitments as well as 3 supplemental requests, which we'll get into in more detail. Finally, debt servicing is up by $28,000 due to the pending parkland acquisition. So as mentioned earlier, supplemental items are one-time or ongoing additions to the existing service levels. Studies, new staffing, new programs, or higher levels of service. Now, all of the requests that we're going to cover on the next few slides are included in our draft budget and in the starting point for consideration. So if anything is deferred or rejected, it'll help to defray the cost impact. Now there's a brief description of all items included in the materials that you have, and more detail will follow on the major requests as part of our reporting for the next meeting. So a quick overview of the bigger ones. We've got a number of fire department personnel additions and adjustments. I've broken that into 5 components for consideration, one of which is the new firefighter. Then we have a $65,000 request from the SBIA for continuing their business development program. We have ATP and parking study recommendations totaling $50,000 in new funding, $30,000 for some standard work on accessibility, and then 2 small items for some economic development and truth and reconciliation initiatives. A number of smaller items total $31,000. So the total 2024 impact of all supplemental items is $430,000, but when we subtract the one-time items from last year, the net impact for this year is $271,000, which is roughly a 2% tax impact out of the 8.42. Now the supplemental list includes a few items that are non-tax funded but nevertheless identified for consideration. So those are grant-funded environmental initiatives as well as a water utility project that's funded from water rates. Now, in addition to the first year impacts, you've got 4 additional years of impacts in your binder, and there are some big ones coming up in year 2, notably the RCMP dispatch cost, as well as the second deputy fire chief. So, as every year, the future year supplementals will be revisited, so you're not necessarily approving those ahead of time. We're just putting them in front of you so you get a full picture of what we're looking at over the next 5 years. So those are to be confirmed next year or later. If there happens to be a need throughout the year to get early approval, we'll bring that to council. So we are waiting for more complete information on some of the items like the RCMP dispatch that I mentioned earlier. In terms of personnel impact, so there's only 1 new position being requested, that full-time firefighter. And I also indicated that the CAO replacement will be a major impact for this year, although it's one time. Total personnel impacts in the budget are $470,000, and that includes the new position we're requesting, as well as contractual obligations and inflationary increases. All of that equates to a 3.4% tax increase. Not all of this impacts the 8.42. Some of it's been covered through other revenue. So in terms of our general operating revenues, almost 2/3 of it is made up of property taxation. So 64.7%. A smaller amount is made up of fees and charges. And I need to stress this is only the general operating. If you look at water and sewer, those are virtually all fees and charges. This is operating only. We're up to about 9% in government transfers, so grants from the province mainly. Also some from the feds. We've got 4.6% of our operating program funded from surplus and reserves. 4.6% in investments and other. So where does the tax dollar go? A lot of it goes to police protection, public works, general government, fire and emergency, a smaller amount, 10.6 to recreation and culture. Community support now makes up 6.5% of our taxes. Planning, building, and bylaw are a fairly small portion. Debt servicing is only 2.7% of our tax-funded expenditures, and capital is just over 1%. Moving on to an overview of our capital program, we've got a total of 12.2 million in our total capital for 2024. This includes 5.1 million in replacement plan projects. Noticing a number is out here. So I will update this for the next meeting, but I believe it's that 5.1 million that's not quite on, because we do have 5.5 million in infrastructure plan projects and another 1 million in other replacement, including vehicles, computer equipment. We have a small amount in recurring programs and 5.4 million in one-time projects. Biggest component of that is the parkland purchase. We've got several active transportation plan projects, a couple of park improvements, and several other projects that are outlined in your materials. So what this 12.2 million does not include is several projects that will be carried forward for completion from last year, including the Beacon West roundabout. We just didn't have an accurate enough number of how much was remaining at year end to bring that forward now. So that'll be added at bylaw adoption time, as well as a few smaller items. Those are items that are already in stream and approved by council, so they won't impact what we're approving at this time at all. In terms of how we're funding that 12.2 million, most of it comes from our reserves at nearly 8 million. We've got 1.28 in borrowing for that parkland acquisition. Canada Community Building Fund is another nearly 2 million. And then a bunch of smaller amounts, including funds carried forward from previous years. Current taxes and user fees of 238,000. Operating grants of 180,000. Sorry, capital grants of 180. North Saanich is contributing 132,000 for some RCMP and Rotary Park capital. And other miscellaneous sources make up approximately $210,000 in funding. So the level of property tax funding for capital is virtually the same as it was last year at roughly 200,000. About 15 years ago, we were at a much higher level of close to $500,000, but our new normal seems to be closer to 200. And that's because we have more of a reliance now on reserve funding. We've built up some additional reserves that help to reduce the impact on current taxation. And external funds like gas tax and the amenities have helped to reduce our tax reliance as well. The land sale funds have really helped over the last few years, but as mentioned, I think we're down to a few small projects over the next 2 years, and then that's gone. So significant projects include 13.6 million over the next 5 years in renewing our infrastructure, both surface and underground. Other asset replacement plans include 1 million for 2024, as mentioned, for vehicles, computer equipment. Major maintenance on Bevan Pier continues and will recur roughly in 2028-ish. Lockside water main replacement is a significant project for council to consider. It's a 1.8 million total, a portion of which was funded last year and is being carried forward. But it will require some external funding, and we're proposing use of the Growing Communities Fund for a phase of that project. The West Side Highway Bike Path is a major project for 2024 as well, although exactly when that will begin is not quite certain. We are waiting on the province to undertake some highway planning there. And there are several park improvements included for 2024 and beyond. So we've talked about the expenditure side, a little bit about how we fund it all. So as mentioned earlier, the town is required to have an ongoing surplus from operations. But that doesn't mean we can't have a deficit in any given year. And whether you have a surplus or deficit is really a year-end thing. It's nothing to do with the budget. What we typically do is we essentially budget for a deficit by using a portion of prior year surplus to balance our budget. And we have a long-standing policy that outlines what our minimum balance of surplus should be, which is based on the previous year's tax revenues. So we typically target 25% accumulated surplus based on the previous year's tax revenues. And we reported to council last year that we were roughly near or just below the policy level, but we didn't need to overreact just yet. We wanted to wait for another year or two just to see whether it balanced itself off, and we'll provide more details through the budget process on that. So we do use a certain amount of surplus each year to balance the budget. This year I'm using $450,000, which is just a little bit more than we used last year. So what this balancing mechanism does is prevents overtaxing for current operations. So the expectation is that the department will manage to bring their budgets in at or below where they're supposed to be, and some savings will be generated, and we won't need to dip into that $450,000 to balance the budget. It's looking like for 2023 we pretty much will break even, and we won't need to take any of our surplus, which is great. So that's why I feel comfortable in using roughly the same level moving into the 2024 budget. So once all other funding sources are exhausted, our last line of defense is property taxes. So our tax increase is mitigated each year by new revenues that we benefit from through growth in our tax base. So general changes in assessment are factored out when we set our rates to keep revenues predictable, and we feature different rates paid by different classes of property. We did approve a tax distribution policy in late 2022, and this is the second year of our phase-in of bringing residential and commercial rates more in alignment. So the general tax increase will typically be slightly larger for residential and slightly lower for commercial because of this phase-in, but for 2024 the effect will be negligible, simply because of the way the the two different property classes changed in assessed value from year to year. So this year, the 8.42% general tax increase is a very close approximation of what residential is facing as of now. So we mentioned the Safe Restart grants, which were a large one-time contribution from our senior governments. It allowed the town to replenish our reserves back in 2020 after our tax cuts, and allow us to carry that business tax reduction forward and never reinstate it. That made our distribution policy phase in that much easier over the next 10 years. And it allowed the town to gradually phase back to full revenues. So our focus for the Safe Restart funding was to reduce the tax impact for residents and businesses from the outset. And the remaining funds after that initial year were used to gradually transition back to full revenues. 2024 will see us use up the remainder of those funds. And as you'll see in the table on the next slide, the difference in the amount of Safe Restart funding used last year versus this year is roughly equivalent to a 2% tax increase. So that's 2% of our 8.24 simply because we're running out of this source. So this shows how much we received and where we've used those funds over the last 5 years. We are down to the last $127,000, which is a significant reduction over last year, and that is simply being used to reduce the tax impact. That table is in your binder as well. So our overall increase in the property taxes we require this year to balance our budget is $1.266 million, which is not that much higher than it was last year. It was roughly $200,000 more. So the first $100,000 of that is covered from new construction. Last year, you might recall that we had an incredibly good year in revenue from tax growth, being $400,000, largely due to construction in the airport lands. So we see a $300,000 swing there between last year and this year. That's $300,000 less to help defray the cost impact. So we're left with a general tax increase of $1.166 million, which is the roughly 8.42 that we're starting with. So this further illustrates what I'm talking about in terms of less mitigating measures than last year. So between Safe Restart and the tax growth revenue, we are looking at $583,000 less to defray the cost impact. That equals a 4.22% tax increase, which is roughly half of our overall figure. So half of that 8.42 is because we've lost these revenue sources. It's not because our costs are increasing dramatically. So this table that some people like and I find really annoying, but it does provide a decent snapshot of where our tax impacts are coming from. So we've got some operational increases. The CAO transition is itemized, increase in reserve transfers, negligible increase in tax-funded capital, as well as debt servicing. Then we have our incremental items, being the supplementals. So we have the one-time amount, the continuous amount, and reduced by the 2023 one-time supplementals, resulting in $270,000 or 1.96%. Finally, we have our offsets, which normally are negative numbers, but we do have that increase because of the loss of safe restart funding. Our tax base growth is very modest, and our increase in the use of surplus also negligible at just over 17,000. So it should be pointed out that a 1% tax increase only generates about $140,000 for us, and it costs the average resident $1.41 a month. So multiply that by 8.42 for the monthly impact for the average resident, which is here. So if you apply the 8.42% increase to what the typical residents paid last year, you're looking at municipal taxes of roughly $1,830, which represents an increase of $142 or about $12 a month over last year. Now, the two other fees collected on the tax notice that benefit the town, being the water and sewer parcel tax, are not increasing at all this year, which takes the overall municipal charge impact to 7.5. A quick look at the 5-year projection of what we're facing. So in the first column, that's the new revenue that I mentioned of 1.266 million. The tax base growth is the first line of defense, and then there's a general tax increase of 1.166, representing an 8.42% increase. So any changes to the year one increase will obviously affect what happens in future years. Let's say if you reduce year one by 2%, then you're looking at potential increase in the projected 2025 impact. Now, year two tends to be overstated, but it wasn't last year. The number we had as a draft last year was 7.99%, and we ended up coming in at 8.42. That doesn't typically happen, but I hope I've done a reasonable job of explaining to you why it did this year. So year two, while it is typically overstated, I think we are looking at another difficult year next year because of those dispatch costs and potentially fire department increases. And then it does level off after that. And just as year two tends to be typically overstated, years 3 to 5 are typically understated because we do our best to project what's coming at us, but we don't really know. But we know that what's hitting us over the last 3 years, we're hopeful anyway, is not likely to recur. And once we incur some of these large costs like the RCMP dispatch, then we're taxing at the appropriate level, and those from year to year should be modest. We do have to believe that inflation will go back to traditional levels, and it's certainly halfway there, and I think going in the right direction. But the cumulative impacts have definitely had their influence on us. Another table that's expected and yet unloved by me is a comparison of our tax increases to inflation over the years. So this goes back to 2020, where Victoria CPI came in at 2.46%, yet our budget was reduced to no impact at all because of COVID. So if you look at the cumulative 5 years of inflation, you're looking at overall 17.7% increase over 2019 costs. That's fairly significant. And the cumulative tax increase as it stands right now with the 8.42 starting point is going to be a cumulative 21.9%, which will be, at this rate, 4 percentage points above inflation for those same 5 years. So, you know what I always say, the inflation factor that is used, being Victoria CPI, is not necessarily the most relevant for the types of costs that we incur. We're more impacted by construction costs as well as resource pricing, oil, gas, and inflation measures the cost of the typical basket of goods, and as you know, our basket of goods is not constant from year to year. We tend to have new obligations, new demands that come to council from internal and external sources, and once you add those to our basket, using inflation as a measure is no longer relevant. So we're nearly there. So the goals for our second meeting on February 20th are to provide additional details on new or complex budget items through staff reports that will be prepared on the agenda, and you'll have a chance to review them ahead of time. That second meeting will provide council with the first opportunity to ask questions, make recommendations on adding or removing items from the budget, and staff will ensure that council is prompted where appropriate at various parts of the review to ask those questions, make those resolutions as required. That second meeting will also be the first opportunity for taxpayers to comment on what is or is not included in the budget. And although we hear from them on an ongoing basis, and those wishes are reflected in the budget, this is a chance for us to determine whether we got it right. So the public will have a chance to comment at the beginning of the meeting and potentially after the second staff presentation, which, as mentioned earlier, will be much shorter than this one and will focus mainly on additional information. I will focus at that time on individual items that impact the tax increase and provide a little more context than we've seen tonight or that you might have in your binders. And the results of that February 20th meeting will be built into a second draft of our financial plan, which is to be considered on March 5th. Again, I don't want to leave it in terms of just how much, but what do you get for it? The first slide focused more on internal services. This one is more of our community support. So we have our community partners. We have Shaw Center, we have Mary Winspear, we have the museum, the Shoal Center, Beacon Community Services. We have the BIA, we have Celebration Society, we have Artsy. A big proportion of our budget goes to supporting these valuable organizations that are valued by the community, and we shouldn't lose sight of the benefits we get through raising these taxes. Now that concludes my presentation. If there are any clarifying questions, I'd be pleased to take them.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you again for what has been a very methodical breakdown, not just of the process to come, but also of the draft financial plan itself. I think it's very helpful for members of committee and for council ultimately as we look to make decisions ultimately on the budget for 2024 and the 5-year financial plan. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the context you provided here around highlighting, what a special community is we have and how effectively town staff have administered funds along with the stewardship from council. So on behalf of committee, thank you very much for the methodical presentation. It certainly is helpful. I'd like to turn now to committee members. in the context of the introduction where Mr. Hisik is really looking to give us time to review our budget binders, which we just received this evening, but either with respect to process or any highlights from here that you'd like maybe some early clarity on, I would ask now if committee members have any questions of Mr. Hisik. I'll start with Councillor Duncan and then Councillor Duck.
Yeah, thank you. This is just a discrepancy I noticed that was in the presentation itself, and since we have that tonight, we might as well clarify it now. On slide 23, the sewer utility, it says user fees increased to $9.55 on the slide deck in our binder, but the one that you presented said $8.85. Do you know which one that is?
It was a last minute change and 885 is the correct
Is the
number.
correct one? Okay, thank you. And I guess just for general interest, when we're looking at the 5-year projections going out, we know that the download dispatch costs are coming. Are those included from 2025 on in those tax increases already? Because I seem to recall them being quite a substantially higher percentage of our budget, but
Thank you, Councillor. They are included, but we don't know the latest projections yet. They could be slightly higher than what we have in there.
okay. Well, that's better than I expected then. Thanks.
And again, it's only 75% impact in year 1 because it starts on April 1.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Next we have Councillor Duck, followed by Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hisik. That was a great presentation. Again, point of clarification, my colleague caught one of them. The other one I just want, just for my own information, slide 37, total 2024 impact of supplemental items is $430,765. And the net impact after one time, 2023, is $270,000. So that's the only addition. We've already budgeted for the other differential there, right? Is that what I'm to understand?
The net amount, the bottom line, includes the 2023 one-time supplementals that are not recurring. So while the total of the 2024 requests is 400 and some odd thousand, it's reduced by those ones that disappear essentially.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Duck, Councillor Novak, and then I have Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hisik, thank you for a very illuminating presentation. I have to say that I'm very confident that the fiscal management in our town is second to none, and I have every confidence that things are being done with most expeditious manner. I do have a few questions of a general nature. Maybe they're high-level strategic, I don't know. But I'd like to start with the reserves. I think early on in the presentation you mentioned that there were $7 million coming out of the reserve fund to fund certain of the capital projects. And that brings down our reserves substantially. I don't remember what the final number is, maybe somewhere 3 to 4 million, maybe 5 from, I think it was 12. But my question is this sustainable? And, you know, how do we look at utilizing reserves over a long period of time when the amount of reserves we're using are greater than the amount we're going to contribute to the reserves in a given year?
Thank you, Councillor. I would like to reinforce that these reserves the balances are cyclical. In some years we're using more than other years. Not every reserve is meant to be built up. Some of them are meant to be essentially consumed as we go. So the infrastructure reserve, for instance, what we're really aiming for is to set aside enough funding each and every year to pay for the annual work that has to be done on average to keep our infrastructure renewed. So ultimately, the amount we spend every year should roughly mirror how much we set aside. We're not quite there yet. An example of reserves that are meant to grow are would be any reserves we might create for building replacement. So if we're putting those aside for a number of years in anticipation of a replacement 20 years hence, then that would be expected to grow. But that's not how we've typically financed that type of expenditure. So while that table does appear concerning, it isn't overly concerning to me. It was worse last year because we went in with an infrastructure plan that was a little less sustainable than what we have this time around. So if you do look at last year's slide, I think you're going to see a bit of an improvement, and you'll notice that what we projected as an ending balance last year was far less than our beginning balance this year. So we have to put in place the funding for any capital project that we intend to do, but it doesn't always proceed at the speed that we anticipate, so the balances will likely be higher at the end of the year.
Okay, so bottom line, you're not overly concerned that we're bringing the reserve balances down to that extent?
Not overly, no, but this is something I was thinking of covering for the next meeting in a bit more detail, but when I opened the presentation by saying staff do everything they can to come in with the lowest possible number, that's by taking advantage of every single internal funding source, including reserves, to keep that tax increase to a minimum. That's not without its impact. So I don't want to use a trite expression like pay me now, pay me later, or robbing Peter to pay Paul, but we do our best to push those impacts down the road to some degree. So by keeping today's increases low, it's not without consuming some of those funds that we could potentially use in future years.
Okay.
So we started a general capital fund maybe 7-8 years ago with the intent to possibly build it up to finance some of our building replacements. But what's happened in reality is we've consumed that over the years as annual funding to get that tax number low.
Okay, thank you. When I see these things, it just sets off alarm bells. I know you have things well in hand. I just wanted to hear it in that depth. My next question is a simple one, but at one point, and I think it was on slide number 40, you showed a pie chart of the expenditures for our town. Is our expenditure ratios or proportions, are they consistent with other towns of our approximate size?
Thank you, Councillor. I'm not at all a fan of that kind of comparison because they're never apples to apples.
Okay.
You look at a town of our size, it doesn't mean they're providing the same basket of goods, not the same level of service or the same services, period. So it's really difficult to make those kind of comparisons. To try and find a community out there that's essentially the same as us is next to impossible. Even comparisons within our own region are relatively meaningless because some jurisdictions, for example, have their own recreation functions, whereas we don't. Some contract out their road maintenance, for instance. Some don't. So it's not an easy thing to do, and I prefer to focus on what's right for the town and not in relation to what anyone else does.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Mr. Chair, I have a couple of questions that maybe our fire chief could answer, because there's a fair bit of the budget increase having to do with the fire department.
So thank you. I'll allow that, but just commenting that we have a detailed report coming before us next week, next committee of the whole meeting, with respect to the fire department and those specific requests. So But I would understand if the fire chief can't address them this evening specifically, but go ahead and let's see how it goes.
All right. It's not too extensive. First of all, it was stated that call volumes are very high. Do you have any idea of why the call volumes seem to be higher than normal?
Through the chair to Councillor Novak, it's a broad range. Definitely medical responses are up, but also as the town has continued to grow in our built form and the amount of people in town, and also I consider in this post-COVID environment when things are so busy, I consider it's an amalgam of many things. Emergency medical responses, as Mr. Hislick referred to, they are a driver of our call volume, about 48%, or about 725 responses last year, which I would consider to be average in the CRD for fire services. But it's a number of things, everything from, I'd say, more people out in the town, a much denser, busier, more populous town. Our unsheltered population is a driver of call volume. There's a number of things. It's not just one single factor.
Okay, fair enough. And would that lead you to believe that these numbers will continue in the same vein?
Again, through the chair, I hope not. But in 2022, we realized a 29% increase in call volume, and last year was just under 24%. So that's, I would hope that a lot of our comparator group are within the CRD. I think we're experiencing in between 8 to 12%. So definitely we were seeing a much higher jump. I would say the average call increase is in between 5 to 7.5% per annum, and I would hope that we would get back to what normal in the coming years, but I can't tell the future. I wish I could.
Okay, fair enough. Then if that call volume should continue on the same linear proportion, do we have sufficient resources to manage that?
Again, through the chair, I don't believe there's any municipal department in the CRD that could withstand year over year 25% increases without a substantive kind of change in staffing. I don't believe that that's going to be the case. I believe this has been 2 unique years, and we'll continue to see an increase in call volume. I believe what we put forward this year is enough to maintain existing service levels and allow us to grow in a way that I think will be sustainable, and that's all we're asking for this year.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm done.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. Next I have Councillor O'Keefe, followed by Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you. My questions have to do with infrastructure replacement, Rolling Communities Fund, and new legislation kind of all rolled into one. So earlier in the report you talked about on page 45 infrastructure replacement of current infrastructure. And what I'm wondering is, we know with the new legislation, good chance of additional densification within Sydney, if we're putting 4 dwelling units on one lot, more bigger sewer lines or water lines or whatever. So I'm wondering, do we have an idea, or are we factoring that into future infrastructure replacement, or is that something that will come in the future? I'll start with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. It's good question about the impacts of the provincial housing policy, and we have recently started on our development cost charge review, and that's one of the impacts we're looking at is how do we predict growth in this new climate. And not only are we looking at DCCs, but also the new amenity cost charge that the province announced. But we're relying on some experts to assist us, but they're also grappling with the same issues of how do you bring predictability to the new regime? And we're going to get there together, but it's not something I can accurately predict right now. I think we're going to have to make reasonable assumptions and adjust as we go. But generally, the town is built out in terms of infrastructure. We're really talking about a limited number of underground pipe upsizings, not a whole bunch. We're not talking about building new roads. We're not talking about extending our utilities to areas where they don't exist. We're simply trying to predict when we'll hit certain thresholds for population growth that will require a certain level of upsizing. And in conjunction with the DCC review, we're also embarking on utility modeling based on the new legislation and the recently approved OCP. So it's all factors we're trying to build in, but it's not as much certainty as we would like at this time, and we're doing our best.
Thanks, and that's kind of sort of what I would expect in this kind of uncertain environment. And you also touched on the new process that's going to be in place for community amenity charges. So I guess what's in my mind is, you know, whether we might get less through that process now, I don't know, because things are going to be rezoned, more densification. And so, you know, taking that into account, what you said about uncertainty, and I'm thinking about our Growing Communities Fund, which is meant to, given to us by the province. My understanding is to help, you know, create the infrastructure for that growth. So is that something we should be cautious about spending as we're looking at this budget, knowing that there is that uncertainty? And do you have any concerns about how much we dip into that Growing Communities Fund in this budget cycle in our quest to kind of reduce the tax impact of some of the things that might be in here?
Well, I would always like to leave funding for the future, but this funding is meant to be used, so as long as we use it in the right ways, I think we're going in the right direction. So you'll see at the next meeting which uses are proposed in addition to the ones that council's already approved, and you'll have a chance at that time to determine whether it makes sense for the community or not. But with some of these things, especially the Lochside water main project, if we don't use that, I'm not sure how else we're going to fund it. I would much rather use that up and borrow later than borrow now and save that for future use.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll now turn to Councillor Gannett, followed by Mayor McNeil-Smith. Councillor Gannett.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hissick, for your presentation and your work, and thank you, Ms. Chen, who I'm sure worked on it as well, who's present in the audience, and the rest of your staff, and also all of staff who have contributed to the budget. It's a lengthy process and a lot of work goes into it, and it's very appreciative of the work that's put in. I just have kind of one general question around the 5-year projection, nothing specific with this budget, but sort of digging into your expertise on this question. If we were to, so the Canada Community Building Fund, which was formerly the gas tax fund, if that fund or that funding from the federal government was to disappear, what implications would that have for our budget?
Roughly a 4% tax increase if you wanted to maintain the same level of capital spending.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. I'm just thinking in terms of the overall environment we're living in, and downsizing of, or passing down of things from provincial in terms of the dispatch costs and you know, increased fire services because our ambulances can't keep up with it. And looking forward to a potential change in federal government and tied this particular fund potentially being tied to housing starts and being withheld. So I'm just wondering, I know it's early to think of that. Anything could happen in a federal government election. But if that were to happen, is that something that you think we should potentially budget for in consideration of the fact that we may not be able to meet targets that are subscribed to us, and that funding could be withheld in the future?
At this time, I have no reason to believe that the program will discontinue. Negotiations have been underway through UBCM for a couple of years now, and we haven't heard the announcement yet. I guess it's not the right time yet, but I fully anticipate that we will see some kind of renewal, whether it's another 10-year agreement or something different. I can't predict, but I'm hoping it's another 10.
Okay, thank you. I guess we just have to hope if there is a change in government, they honor it. But I appreciate your answer. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll echo the thanks from colleagues for your presentation, Mr. Hissick and Ms. Chen. And thank you for the consistency in the presentation of the budget in our binders. I think that's been very helpful to council, committee over the years, as well as members of the public that take an interest, and the consistency in your presentation to council and the community. And I want to extend thanks also, as other colleagues have, to all the budget managers in the organization, not only for the preparation and work that goes into the preparation of the budget, but we heard something I think very important that reminds us of the good fiscal management we have in the town of Sydney, and that is through the good fiscal management of everyone responsible for budget in the organization. I heard Mr. Hissick say we drew down our surplus, much less, I'm sorry I don't remember the number, but significantly less than was budgeted last year because of the careful management of staff. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate that. My one question you touched on was in the capital budgeting. I think the capital budget is for 2024 is something like 12.2 million, a little higher than previous years, and we can certainly look into that. But you made reference to, as we know, there will be projects that are carried forward from year to year. You made reference to the completion of the traffic circle. So as I understand, any and all carry forwards from capital plan we'll see as an addition to that 12.2 million at a future meeting, or you might suggest it might be as the timing might be at the time of the bylaw?
I do not intend to bring them forward during this process because it's all projects that are in progress. You can't undo them now. You can't pull the plug on them, especially the roundabout. So I didn't want to obfuscate what's in this year's budget for consideration with trying to predict what all those carry forward amounts would be. Having said that, there are some carry forward amounts in the budget. It's just, it's not an exact science as to what makes it and what doesn't. If we have a reasonable estimate of how much will be carried forward, I might include it. If we are just guessing, then and there's no real opportunity for the project to be terminated, it just gets in the way of considering what really matters. So last year we, I think our figure was something like 15.5 million, including the roundabout. So this year we'll probably hit that with the carry forwards.
Thanks, Mr. Hissick. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mayor. Look around the table and see if there are any other questions for Mr. Hissick of his presentation. And seeing none at this time, I will thank you, Mr. Hissick, again for your presentation. Thank you very much to senior staff in attendance. Mr. Clary, our Director of Engineering, is here online. Chief Mickelson for joining us. And thank you, Ms. Chen, for joining us as well. Again, greatly appreciate the approach that you've taken, Mr. Hissick, to help prepare us for what lies ahead as we look to dive into some detail in the budget in our next meeting. Thank you, members of committee. We have no other business on this agenda, and so I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you. I have a mover and seconder. All in favor? Thank you. Motion carries. We're adjourned.